Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Speeki webinar series. My name is Scott Lane, and I'm going to be the leader of today's webinar. For those of you that have not joined a Speeki webinar before, we welcome you, and we hope that you enjoy this session. The Speeki webinars are designed to pick on one particular topic and address as much as we can to give guidance and support and direction for you in a 30-minute period. For those of you that have joined before, welcome back. Given that we have between 200 and 1,000 people in most of these webinars, it's sometimes challenging to answer questions throughout the webinar. However, if you do have questions, I encourage you to leave the questions in the chat function, and I will try and answer them towards the end of the session. If I don't get a chance to get to all of the questions, we will be making this recording available to you, and we'll also address some of the questions offline on email. So whether you're a new time participant or you've joined us before, welcome to this session. Today's session is focused on the audit side. Most of you are familiar that sustainability reporting is now becoming very common around the world, sometimes regulated and sometimes less regulated. And in some cases, companies are bound to produce sustainability reports, and in other cases, it may be done voluntarily. Equally applies to the assurance or the audit of those particular sustainability reports. Now, the title of today's presentation is focused on how do you select your assurance provider? Now, we've indicated that it relates to CSRD report assurance, which of course is the directive for corporate sustainability reporting in Europe. However, the same principles can apply to whichever standard your sustainability report is produced within. So as we go through this presentation, I will walk you through some of the key things that I think you should consider when you're deciding on an assurance provider. Now, it should go without saying, but I am obviously going to disclose that Speeki is a provider of these services. So whilst I have a perspective on what the sort of providers you will engage, it obviously comes with my perspective, which is somewhat narrow. So I'll try and be as impartial and open as I can throughout this presentation, but in full disclosure, Speeki provides some of these services. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, most of you are fully aware that assurance of non-financial reporting is a relatively new area for most companies. Now, some companies have done their sustainability report for many years, but not many have done independent third-party assurance of those reports. And indeed, that concept is relatively new. Even the GRI reporting, which has been in place for almost 20 years, only a section of those reports are really done to a limited assurance level. Now, being that it is new, the area is relatively new. Having audits of your non-financials or your sustainability report is relatively new also. And in many cases, the practices and the procedures of the audit providers are relatively new as well. And Speeki is no different. While Speeki has been doing audits and assurance for almost 15 years on the ISO assurance side, under these standards, it is also a new product line for us, like many other providers in the market. So with that in mind, we will touch on some of the points that you should consider if you're going to embark on this concept and you're going to embark on this project and selecting the particular agency or firm that you might involve as part of that process. Now, of course, as I mentioned, it is new. It is still developing, and it's in a state of regulation. So some of the future regulations in some countries may have an impact on the sorts of companies that you will choose. And we'll cover that in just a few minutes. My main message for today is that the things that I will cover are relatively straightforward and common sense. If you're an organization that is going through sustainability reporting, I would encourage you to get those reports audited. I think that is the right decision. My strong recommendation is to do that on your terms, meaning you may not be required right now to produce a report or indeed to have it audited. But my recommendation is that you should do so, and you should do assurance, but do it on your terms, your time frame, your deadlines, your approach. Far better to do it on your terms than on a regulator's terms where you're under pressure to get things out. So see this as a bit of a practice and as a bit of a learning exercise for those companies that are not yet required to do assurance, but are looking to do that in the future. A pre-run, pre-experience with audit is a good idea. So let's get started on some of the key things that I think are important when you're selecting your provider. Now, of course, as I said, many of these are relatively straightforward, but I think it's important for you to put this all in context. Now, firstly, whether we're talking about CSRD or we're talking about any of the other reporting obligations around the world, for which there now are very many, there are often some requirements of the local country. So the country in which your company is registered, typically that headquarters company, the local laws in that country may dictate who can do your assurance of your sustainability reporting. Now, we have seen somewhat of a fractured environment when it comes to countries in Europe and also around the world when it comes to this topic. Now, there's a couple of different ways that countries could go. They could go the route that says all sustainability report audit needs to be done by a statutory auditor, so those that audit financials. That's one option. Another option is that it has to be the same provider that does your financial audits. That's option 2. Option 3 is an option that is currently proposed in many places, but not always being executed, is that it should be open to anyone, any company, any firm that has the competency and the experience and the independence and meets certain rules should be able to audit and assure your sustainability reporting. So the point is that the underlying law in some countries is mandating one of those strands. So the first task that you've really got to do when you're deciding on an audit firm is work out whether or not that audit firm can actually do the work for you in that particular country based on where you're located. So that's rule number 1. Now, in Europe, there are some additional twists to that in the extent that as European laws allow for mutual recognition. So if you are certified to do something in your home country, then you can operate in multiple countries across Europe. So there is some mutual recognition pieces to consider as well, but your provider should be able to explain that to you and take you through that strategy. So in Speeky's case, we're a French company that provides our audit and assurance work under French law. If we're certified across Europe. So first step is the local countries may dictate the pool of auditors that you can use. So that should be one of the first places that you go to. Now, again, this is somewhat in a state of flux. And in many cases, there are no laws. There's nothing being put in the books. So a little bit of research might be required, both on your case or in your advisor's case, to help you identify that particular issue. Now, the next piece that I think you really need to look at is independence. Now, most of us know when we think about audit, we think about third-party audits, there is clearly an independence requirement. An audit by its nature involving third-party audits is an independent process. Now, people say that they're independent. Now, the question is, what does that actually mean? Well, we'll come to some of the requirements in a moment, but at a basic fundamental level, independence is well known to all of us. It's not only at the firm level, so the firm should be independent, but also the auditor level as well. So on our side, and I can speak for Speeki and our services, we look at it from both perspectives. We look at it from the firm perspective, and we'll also look at it from the auditor perspective. So from a firm perspective, yes, obviously, we cannot audit something that we have been involved in building. We if we've been involved in advice or consulting and building your sustainability report, obviously we cannot audit that. Now that should go without saying. Of course, the challenges are, what happens if there's another part of the audit firm or another part of the firm, but not audit, that provides you with services? Is that going to conflict? Now, on the Speeki side, because we're a smaller player, we believe that it's any advice. So if we do work for you in any capacity from any entity on the consulting side, then we would not be independent in order to provide audit services. So the point is, at a firm level, you should have this dialogue, and you really need to think through and be cautious about the firm that you select and whether or not that independence level is actually there. The last thing that you want to have happen is to be challenged. Now, in this day and age, with social media and with the ability to research, the ability for shareholders or activists in order to speak up, it is highly likely, if there is a question of integrity around independence, that issue will come to light. So I strongly encourage you to really think through this independence piece and to be on the cautious side when it comes to the firm level independence. Now, at an auditor level, we also have rules around independence, and we would encourage you to think through both the firm level and auditor level as well. Now, at the auditor level, that essentially means that the individual who is involved in this audit needs to be independent. So the firm may be independent, but the individual may have come to that firm from a competitor of yours. They may have been involved in auditing a competitor. They may have been a previous employee of your firm or been an employee of a sister firm. So looking at that work history and that independence of the auditor in addition to the firm is actually pretty important. Again, these things should be driven by the audit firm, but in my view, it requires the two parties to come together, the audit firm and the auditee, in order to really meet that independence understanding and to make sure that you are in fact independent. Not only is it a rule and a requirement, but again, always look at this from the perspective of an activist or someone who wants to pick a fight with you, wants to undo the work that you have done, and to challenge it. So think through that perspective. On the Speeki side, we have a lot of rules around our auditor independence, conflicts checks, both on the investment side, work history, employment history, a whole bunch of rules that we need to go through and sign off on in order for an auditor to work on a project. So the second thing I would focus on is independence. It's important, and in today's state, I think it's important to get right. The next area that I think is really important is technology. Now, there are a lot of audit firms out there, and some of them are, I guess, old school. Some of them might be a little bit of the classic throw people at this issue. And they tend to throw quite junior people in volume numbers who occupy conference rooms in your business for weeks or months on end, doing various checks and not seemingly making much progress. I've been the subject of that myself. So I would strongly suggest that you think about the technology that the firm is going to use to make your life easier and to make their life more efficient. These days, if a firm is not using technology to help on the audit, if they're not using proprietary systems or a third-party system, they're not crunching numbers, they're not assessing, they're not using AI, they're not using tracking, they're not using online reporting, you're not sharing information over email, but you're doing it through a secure platform, secure location. If you're not doing all those things, then frankly, this audit is going to get long, complicated, paper-based in most cases, or at least shuffling documents across email. It's not going to be an efficient use of anyone's time. We are now in a technology era, and we're in an era of AI. The audit firm must be deploying those technologies in order to help get these audits done and to get them done efficiently. That will have an impact on you, both on time, but also on cost as well. So the questions that I would be asking your audit firm is I'd be asking them, how do we work with technology? Do you access our technology? Do you have your own technology? What are we doing about document transfer? What are we doing about recording interviews? What are we doing about collecting information? What sort of techniques do you use to try and do report generation or to generate reports quickly? What sort of technology are you going to use to make our audit faster and simpler? The old days of sending in multiple resources, sit in conference rooms and shuffle through papers that you constantly provide audit team members, that is just simply not something that I would recommend that you do. So again, in this area, I would strongly recommend that you walk through this technology question with your audit firm. Again, it's an option which will save you time and save you money. Now, the most important thing that I hope you take away with from today is that sustainability report auditing and providing limited assurance, I think, is one of the most challenging things that we could do in the audit profession. Now, I've been auditing programs for a long time in areas around compliance and systems and legal issues and due diligence and sustainability. I think sustainability reporting assurance is really tough. And it's tough because it covers a lot of area, covers a lot of topics, covers a lot of ground. Now, it is limited versus a broader assurance. So as a result, it is somewhat simpler, but it covers a lot of ground. So the trick is to find auditors that have got that depth of coverage. Not only do they need to have the depth of coverage across all the topics, but they need to understand the reporting requirements, obviously, of the standards, but they also need to be understand the governance systems, the stakeholder engagement. They need to understand the framework that you put together when you talk about sustainability. And they need to be able to absorb that information quickly, and they need to make a decision, is that sensible or reasonable? Is that something that is jumping out as a concern, or is it acceptable? Now, in order to do that on the fly quickly, you need to be relatively quick and you need to be relatively broad on your experience so that you can make those calls. So if someone shows you a materiality assessment, you should know the company, you should know their industry, you should know their competitors, you should know their risks, you should have reviewed all that information. You had looked at their materiality risk model. You had looked at their scoring system. You looked at the way they've engaged stakeholders. You looked at their impacts, their risks and opportunities, and you've looked at the results, and you've been able to assess whether or not the process made sense and whether or not the outcome made sense, frankly, in a matter of minutes. Now, in order to do that requires an auditor that is sensible, practical, pragmatic, and skillful on a number of topics. And that is quite challenging to find. Again, our view is that auditors should be experienced, they should be senior people, and they should be able to make those decisions within minutes. What you don't want to get into is having junior auditors interviewing you and your team for hours or days or weeks on end about topics that frankly is just filling in time, and those topics could have been assessed and reviewed in minutes if the auditor actually knew what they were doing. So the big focus when you're selecting your audit for these projects is look at the auditors. Who is going to be involved? Ask to see the exact people. I want to see the names. I want to see the CVs. I want to see their experience. I want to see their commitments. I want to see their conflicts disclosures. And I want to see that these people are going to be available for these projects, which I'll cover also in a moment. So getting those auditors on board and committed by the audit firm, I think is really important to do. It will save you a lot of time if you get the right auditors and that right audit team. Now, you also will need to think through to what extent is this audit going to go beyond headquarters and into the countries. So, for example, if you've got some major groups within your company which are located offshore or in a particular in Asia or in Africa or the Middle East or somewhere, which, for example, have significant carbon use, and that carbon use is coming into Central and Central is being audited, you may need to think through whether or not that region is also subject to audit to validate some of those carbon material, for example, or human rights, supply chain questions. All of these issues need to be thought through. So there may be some need to make sure that we've got auditors with language skills or that can travel or that can do some of these remote interviews. So think through the audit skills that you've got to have. It's really important. Think through the auditors, make sure they're available, and make sure they've got the skills. Now, at the risk of somewhat embarrassment, I've included a one-page review of my skills when it comes to auditing. So I tend to use this when I talk to clients. I've got environmental skills, governance, social, and other skills, particularly around AI. So again, lead auditors in energy management, in carbon, in corruption, in compliance, in health and safety, in human rights. You can see the sorts of training that the auditor has done in different areas, the experience that they've got, the projects they've worked on. You can see at every single point, every point within the E, the S, and the G, the depth of knowledge that they've got. Now, if they haven't got that level of knowledge, you can't see that they've got experience in GHG, in 14064, or they've got experience in other validation models, or in human rights, or in governance, or in whistleblower, corruption, and bribery, and even in some of energy or waste and water. If they're not experienced in these areas, they haven't been auditing these areas, then it's probably a question whether or not they're the right people for you. The next is attitude. Now, we've all experienced audits, and the old saying of when you get to an audit and you say, we're really happy to have the auditor here, that's probably the first line in auditing. And the second line in auditing is when the auditor, says, I'm here to help. That is an unfortunate perspective that is probably still true today. In this area, in sustainability, I look at it from the perspective of saying we're all working on the same team, meaning we all want to have organizations that have good sustainable practices, have integrated it into the fabric of their business, are generating value for their stakeholders, including the planet, and they're communicating that in a report, which we believe is valid, correct, is reasonable, and that is consistent with the reporting standards. So the validation of that exercise is an approach where improvement is important. We're looking at things from how do we make this easier, better, improve? How do we make it more accurate? How do we make it clearer? All of these things are areas that I think are really important attitudes to have when you're an auditor. The old style of catching people out or trying to identify gaps or searching endlessly for the mistake or the error in the calculation, I think those days, frankly, should be set aside. What we're doing here is we're doing a different type of auditing. We're doing an audit to validate the things that I said and to make sure that this report can be relied on by our stakeholders and our regulators, and it meets these standards. So the attitude of the auditors is really important, and it needs to be driven in this way that is positive looking, that it is an approach that is pragmatic and is always looking at driving improvement. So if your auditors are not prepared to give you that guidance, give you that coaching, give you that direction, help identify best practices, room for improvement, if that's not happening, or they don't feel confident doing that, because frankly, they've come from the financial world where that is not done, I think that's probably not the auditor or the audit firm for you. So along with the experience, this is closely related, because in order to have that attitude and have that focus on improvement, you need to know what you're talking about, which is why you need to have the experience, and you need to be able to link those two things together. So this is very close to the experience piece. Now, of course, we would go without saying, but price and availability is key. Now, price, I believe, firstly, that these things should be capable of being pretty much set prices. And I think they should be able to be scoped, and I think they should be fixed price. I think these relatively straightforward engagements, albeit have some depth and some variables, but they should be pretty close to being fixed. You also need to think through the availability. Now, we've seen a bit of a challenge here with companies thinking that this process is a end of financial year, month after the end of financial year process where the report gets written, it gets thrown across to the auditors and the auditors do some work. I think that's not a good approach. The approach here needs to be thinking through this as an ongoing commitment. So whether it's a 3-year or 6-year deal or whatever the deal is, that you are recognizing that it's not once a year, but it's phased in throughout the year. So we'll do these steps in Q1, these steps in Q2, Q3, and Q4. So for example, there's no point in looking at governance issues or looking at policies and procedures and rules and playbooks and stakeholder engagement. There's no point in looking at that in Q4 or Q5, if you follow me. That can all be done in Q1. You can get all those things done in Q1. The methodology work can be done in Q1, Q2. The collecting and the process of collecting will be done in Q2, Q3. So Q4, by the time you get to that audit period, you're really looking at the end of financial year numbers. So the process has already been agreed, and you already have reviewed that process. You've already reviewed that governance model throughout the year. So think through that pricing and availability module concept. If the audit firm is saying we're going to pop up in the month after you close and then audit that year, I think that's a mistake. I think it needs to be phased in throughout the year. And again, it's similar to that attitude and improvement piece. The auditor has to go along with you on this process. They have to be part of the team. It shouldn't be an us versus them model. Even though we're independent, we are capable of being independent and providing that support. Now, there are a number of other rules that an audit firm needs to meet. Now, sustainability reporting and audit of it is still in a flux, as I mentioned at the start. But there are a number of international guidance which has been issued for firms. So people like us need to follow certain things. There is a general standard, and I won't go through these in detail, but known as ISO 5000, which is relatively new, which is a standard for auditing sustainability. Now, this standard recently released, used to be for a 3000 standard, now it's a 5000, but it covers all these principles. So it talks about the processes that we go through, the standards we have around governance and leadership and quality and ethics and integrity, our values, our resources, our engagement process. All of this is documented in this relatively massive document called 5000. We follow that document, as should every other audit firm. That document also refers to a code of ethics, which has been set up, which typically audit firms like us will also agree to. Basic stuff, but it includes there. Most of the standards also require you to have a quality management system in place. There are a number of quality management systems in place. The quality management system the firm should have as well. Now, most big firms will have that. Smaller firms may or may not have that. But it is absolutely reasonable for you to ask the firm these questions. So, finally, safeguards. There's a number of safeguards that the firm should have in place to protect you. So, again, clarifying their role on independence, clarifying their role on quality, confirming acceptance, appropriateness of instructions. All of these safeguards should be in place at the firm level, and you should make sure that they exist. So in closing, before we get to our top 5, this can be a real help to you. This can be a great driver of your sustainability programs. It can add a lot of value to sustainability programs. But if you pick the wrong audit firm, the one that's not going to focus on that, then this is going to be an incredibly painful exercise that I wouldn't wish on anyone. So make the right decision, make the right inquiries, and get the right firm to help you. Now, for those of you that attended Speeki webinars before, we always finish with the top 5, and I'm going to do these relatively quickly because most of it we have already covered. So my top 5 things that I would think through is the follows. Firstly, competency across those range of topics. There's a lot to cover. Now, based on your materiality assessment, you might have specific areas in social or governance that are really high risk. You need to make sure that your auditors are high risk and understand those areas as well. Now, it's a little bit different around the pricing. In my view, these should be 3-year engagements and they should be fixed term. Again, make sure that you get some clarity on that. I've heard all sorts of price variability in the industry, some of them extraordinarily high. I think it's really important to narrow that down. Thirdly, I think you need to get auditors that are practical, real-life examples, pragmatic, sensible, structured, risk-based. The last thing you want is some pedantic, non-business focused financial accountant, because this model is this sustainability piece is defined by you. You define your risks, impacts, and opportunities. You define your materiality. You're setting the standards. The standards are the framework, but you're deciding how that works. So part of the auditor's job is to validate whether or not that system works and that framework has been applied. You need some pragmatism in that. Number 4, attitude. Got to be open attitude, got to be a learning attitude. And the 5th is that what you're really thinking through is to audit and validate the sustainability system, the system that you've built to produce this report and the report itself. So as you go through, the way in which you do sustainability is just as important as the production of that report. Obviously, there's a lot of solutions out there. Speeki has some as well, as I mentioned. If you do need more help or questions on this area, please feel free to reach out to me. The overwhelming point that I would leave you with is the decision to select your audit firm should be a cautious one. Don't assume that it should be the same as your financial auditor. I think personally it should be different, and it should be a different set of skills that should be applied. All the very best in your audit programs, and thank you for listening to this edition of the Speeki webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you at future editions. Take care.